let's suppose that that this kind of scenario that we've developed here with the latency reactant continues over many iterations of evolutionary development, so that it becomes quite a sophisticated range of dispositions which are transmitted as cues to these other creatures, and possibly reciprocally, that this one picks up cues from these, from here and there, so that this becomes a sophisticated situation and correspondingly sophisticated machinery, apparatus within the cognitive machinery of the creatures. And then let's then imagine that these same creatures are now in a different context. So maybe there's something like a cliff wall or a wall of stone or something like that. There they are. They just happen to be there. And it turns out, by chance, they're in a set of positions that's similar to where they would be if they were in their choreography chasing after the quarry. And if this one happens to glance a certain way for whatever reason, what could happen is that that might trigger off the cognitive machinery, refresh a latency, and cause for a while the creatures to sort of latch back into the choreography as though they were chasing a quarry, even though they're not. And so it's sparked off the machinery, and it's kind of to an extent bound some of the creatures into the choreography due to latency. Supposing that were to happen in this kind of random way, but what it would mean, the implications of that happening are that we've engaged cognitive machinery outside of its normal context, and that's kind of what we're looking for in terms of the development of long-range anticipation. So this kind of scenario, you can imagine, creates a sort of possibility of that happening, but it is pretty random. And 9 times out of 10, something like this happening, it'd be really effectively a false start. Since there's no quarry there, in reality it's a false start. It's a distraction. It could just waste their time. Most of the time, that wouldn't really be very useful. But supposing that there was a circumstance where something like what you would call a false start actually had adaptive value, and you could imagine how that could happen, because it might act like a sort of rehearsal where you could practice a bit of what you do without being in the real situation, without perhaps avoiding certain risks that are involved when you're in the real situation. So Occasionally, although most of these kind of events would be false starts, there may be other situations where it does have, purely by chance, adaptive value, giving them the chance in a way what we would say as practicing, although of course, stressing again, they're not aware of that. It's just for them something that happens randomly. But if it is adaptive, and in a high risk environment, such a thing could be adaptive, so that successive increments of evolution then favour an adaptation of the cognitive machinery towards allowing this kind of out of context triggering of a choreography or a part of a choreography to occur. So that could happen, and that's what we're calling displacement. It's one form of displacement. A displacement of the use of the triggering off of the cognitive mechanism outside the normal context. Now, the objection that you could raise to this is, well, how, supposing it is adaptive, supposing by sort of practicing the creatures get better at what they're doing, but outside of the normal, how does that information get preserved? And if that comes down to the adjustment of parameters, weights, loadings in the cognitive machinery, how does that get preserved? Because for it to be useful, there would have to be some way that certain parameters are adjusted and then preserved. Outlining this circumstance doesn't explain how that happens, but it does offer a type of circumstance which favours displacement, but more work required as to the details of how it would work, but it looks favourable.